For most of human history, war was brutal, but it was limited. Not morally limited, structurally limited. Armies were made of people who already existed. Weapons were extensions of daily tools. Campaigns followed seasons. Food, loyalty, and distance imposed natural restraints. When those limits were reached, war stopped. Not because rulers chose restraint, but because the system enforced it. Power did not need large balance sheets. It needed time, land, and people willing to return home. This is the familiar picture of pre-modern warfare. What is often missed is not how war was fought, but how it was paid for. Or more precisely, how little permanent financing was required. Before gunpowder, war consumed resources temporarily. Afterward, it consumed them continuously. Gunpowder did not simply make weapons more destructive, it changed the cost structure of power itself. Cannons required metal, engineers, transport, and maintenance. Fortifications had to be rebuilt, thicker, lower, angled. Armies could no longer rely on personal equipment or seasonal levies. They required standardized weapons, constant resupply, and year-round readiness. War stopped being episodic. It became infrastructural. This is the structural break. Once warfare required permanent investment, rulers faced a new problem. Loyalty was no longer enough. Temporary levies were insufficient. Emergency contributions could not sustain standing forces that existed even in peacetime. The constraint shifted from manpower to money. And when the constraint becomes financial, the system must adapt financially. Local power structures could not absorb these costs. Decentralized authority was too fragmented. Small treasuries could not fund fortresses, artillery, and professional armies simultaneously. The logic of gunpowder favored scale. It favored predictability. It favored centralization. Not because rulers wanted it, because the math demanded it. As war grew more expensive, restraint no longer came from scarcity. It came from financing capacity. Whoever could pay longer could fight longer. Victory shifted away from courage and toward endurance. This was not immediately obvious. Early firearms seemed crude. Traditional elites dismissed them. But the real transformation was happening behind the battlefield. In treasuries, supply lines, and accounting rooms, gunpowder made war legible in numbers. Once costs could be calculated, they could be planned. Once planned, they could be financed. And once financed, they could be extended beyond natural limits. This is where money enters the story as infrastructure. What followed was not a single invention, but a cascade. Permanent taxation replaced temporary extraction. Public borrowing replaced ad hoc contributions. Financial institutions expanded not to facilitate trade, but to sustain force. The battlefield did not change first. The balance sheet did. Gunpowder did not centralize power by decree. It did so by making decentralization financially obsolete. Systems that could not absorb rising costs were quietly displaced by those that could. And once war became affordable through finance, it stopped enforcing its own limits. This was the moment violence became systemic. Once war became permanent, finance had to become permanent with it. This is the shift most people overlook. Gunpowder warfare did not merely increase costs during conflict. It created costs that existed even in peace. Armies no longer disbanded. Fortresses required maintenance. Artillery had to be replaced. Supply chains could not be paused without risk. The state acquired fixed expenses. And fixed expenses require predictable income. Temporary extraction no longer worked. Emergency levies produced resistance. Negotiated contributions created uncertainty. To sustain standing forces, rulers normalized taxation. What had once been occasional became routine. What had once required consent became assumed. This was not a political choice. It was a financial adaptation. But taxation alone was not enough. Gunpowder wars expanded faster than revenue. Campaigns stretched across years. Equipment costs compounded. Losses required replacement. Even efficient systems faced shortfalls. The gap between what could be collected and what needed to be spent widened. That gap was bridged with borrowing. Public debt did not emerge as a mistake. It emerged as a solution. States issued obligations not to fund prosperity, but to maintain force. Credit allowed rulers to fight now and pay later. It transformed time into a resource. Once borrowing became normalized, a new logic entered governance. Wars were no longer limited by immediate capacity. They were limited by credibility. As long as lenders believed repayment was possible, conflict could continue. The constraint shifted again, from revenue to trust. This is where finance becomes power. Early financial institutions expanded primarily to service this need. They did not grow because markets demanded them. They grew because states did. Managing debt, issuing bonds, and stabilizing currency became central functions of governance. The state and the financial system fused. But borrowing carries consequences. Debt accumulates. Interest compounds. Obligations persist beyond the conflict that created them. Servicing past wars becomes a permanent burden on the present. When direct taxation threatens stability, governments turn to subtler tools. This is where inflation enters the system. By altering the value of money rather than the level of extraction, states could reduce the real cost of obligations quietly. Prices rose gradually, wages lagged, savings eroded. The burden was dispersed across the population without a single moment of confrontation. Inflation did not eliminate cost. It redistributed it over time. This made permanent warfare socially survivable. The population did not consent to each conflict. It absorbed them. The cost was embedded in everyday life rather than demanded explicitly. The link between war and sacrifice weakened, even as spending increased. This is the critical legacy of the gunpowder economy. Money stopped functioning as a brake on power. It became a buffer, a way to extend action beyond immediate limits. Finance enabled continuity when direct consent failed. As these systems matured, authority centralized further. Only large, coordinated institutions could manage taxation, debt, and currency at scale. Decentralized power structures became inefficient. Financial complexity made them obsolete. Gunpowder did not just change armies. It changed what a state had to be. And once systems evolved to absorb cost, they rarely returned to restraint. Once war became financeable, it ceased to enforce restraint. This is the final transformation of the gunpowder economy. In earlier systems, conflict ended when people or provisions ran out. Losses were immediate. Recovery was required. War imposed its own limits. Gunpowder removed those limits by introducing an intermediary: money. And money can be stretched. When costs exceed tolerance, they can be deferred. When debt grows uncomfortable, it can be rolled forward. When obligations become politically difficult, their impact can be diluted through inflation. None of these eliminate cost. They relocate it. This relocation is what makes modern systems durable. The population no longer confronts the full price of conflict at once. Sacrifice becomes indirect. It appears as higher prices, slower growth, persistent debt, and gradual erosion of purchasing power. The connection between policy and consequence weakens. This is not deception. It is design. Systems evolve to survive pressure. Gunpowder created pressure too large to absorb honestly. Finance provided a way to distribute it across time and across people who were never consulted. As this logic stabilized, it extended beyond war. Permanent military spending normalized permanent taxation. Permanent taxation normalized permanent debt. Permanent debt normalized inflation. Each layer reduced resistance. Each layer increased endurance. The state became less dependent on immediate consent. Authority could persist, even when public tolerance was thin. Continuity replaced legitimacy as the primary objective. This is the modern inheritance of the gunpowder economy. Technology raised the price of power. Finance made that price payable. Centralization followed naturally. Managing taxation, debt, currency, and military logistics required scale. Smaller, decentralized systems could not compete. They were not conquered. They were outperformed financially. Over time, this produced states that feel stable even when strained, systems that appear resilient even when burdened, conflicts that feel distant even when costly. War did not disappear, it became embedded. The legacy is visible everywhere. In large standing institutions, in persistent public debt, in financial systems designed to absorb shock rather than prevent it, in the normalization of costs that outlive the decisions that created them. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means restraint is no longer automatic. When money replaces scarcity as the limiting factor, limits become negotiable. When limits become negotiable, systems tend to expand until they encounter mathematics they cannot defer. Gunpowder taught states a lasting lesson. Violence is not constrained by morality alone. It is constrained by cost. And when systems are built to absorb cost indefinitely, the question is no longer whether power will be used, but how long it can be financed. History does not repeat, but once technology rewires incentives, the structure endures. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.